sound of gunshots shattered the twilight silence as the sun bled crimson across the rugged mountains of Redemption Creek territory. A young woman, her dress torn and muddied, ran barefoot through the scrubland. Each desperate step sent jolts of pain through her bleeding feet as thorns and sharp rocks sliced into her flesh. Morgan Rivers stumbled down a steep embankment, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The distant sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closing in like thunder on the horizon. The distant howl of coyotes mixed with cruel laughter echoed from the ridge, making Morgan's blood run cold. These weren't just men. They were predators. Panic surged through her body as she reached a shallow river, the cold water shocking her system as she splashed into it. The water turned pink with the blood from her feet. "There's nowhere to run, girl," a man's voice called from the ridge above. "You belong to Decker now." Morgan turned, her eyes wide with terror as she saw a silhouette approaching on horseback. In that moment, she made her choice. Better to die on her own terms than return to that hell. "Just kill me," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "I'd rather die than go back there." The rider pulled his horse to a stop, his face obscured beneath a weathered hat. His hand moved slowly toward the holster at his side. Jackson Blackwood had been riding the perimeter of his ranch when he heard the gunshots. 48 years had taught him to recognize the difference between a hunting party and trouble. This was definitely the latter. "My pa always said, the measure of a man isn't how he falls, but how he rises after," Jackson muttered to himself, a habit formed from years of solitude. His calloused hand instinctively dropped to the Colt Navy 1851 on his hip, a weapon that had seen him through countless battles and had taken more lives than he cared to remember. This old Colt had seen him through hell and back. Some days he wondered if it knew more of his sins than any priest ever would. The revolver's ivory grip was worn smooth from years of use, its barrel meticulously maintained despite its age. The sight of the young woman in the river stopped him cold. Her face was bruised, her lips split and swollen. Dark welts marked her arms, and her dress, what was left of it, hung in tatters. Jackson had seen that look before, the look of someone hunted. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and steady as the mountains themselves. "I ain't here to hurt you." Morgan backed deeper into the river, shivering as the cold water reached her waist. "They'll kill you too if they find me here." Her eyes darted back and forth, searching the ridge for her pursuers. Jackson dismounted, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Who's after you, girl?" "Decker's men," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "From the Whiskey Palace." Jackson's jaw tightened at the name. Victor Decker, a name he'd hoped never to hear again, a name that haunted his nightmares. "How far behind are they?" "I don't know. Maybe an hour." Tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. "Please, if you're going to turn me in, just shoot me now." Jackson removed his coat and held it out. "I ain't turning nobody in. Come on out of that water before you freeze to death." His eyes scanned the horizon. "I've got a score to settle with Victor Decker anyway." Later inside his modest ranch house, Jackson handed Morgan a cup of coffee while she sat wrapped in a blanket near the fire. The warmth had brought some color back to her cheeks, but her eyes remained haunted. "They told me I'd be serving drinks," she said, staring into the flames. "My pa died last winter. Farm got taken by the bank. Victor Decker came through town offering work to girls. Said it was good money, just serving drinks to miners and railroad men." Jackson nodded grimly. It was a story he'd heard before, the oldest trap in the West. "First night there, I found out what kind of serving they really meant." Her voice hardened like steel tempered in fire. "I refused. That's when the beating started. Decker himself said he'd break me one way or another." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a burn mark shaped like a snake. "His brand, he calls it the Viper's Kiss." Jackson's hand tightened around his coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. The snake brand. Victor Viper Decker's calling card. The same mark his daughter Emma had worn when they found her body 10 years ago. "You're safe here," Jackson said, rising to his feet, his voice tight with controlled fury. "For now." Dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Jackson hadn't slept. He stood on his porch watching the horizon, waiting. A man could feel trouble coming in his bones the same way he could feel a storm. Inside his bedroom, he opened a trunk that hadn't been touched in years. Beneath folded clothes lay a leather-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a Winchester .73 rifle. The gun that won the West, some called it. Jackson called it an old friend. He cleaned the weapon with practiced precision, his finger instinctively finding the worn spot on the trigger, right where it needed to be for that perfect shot. Jackson's hands remembered what his mind tried to forget. Memories of a time before blood and betrayal had turned him into a ghost of his former self. A cloud of dust on the horizon pulled him from his thoughts. Riders were approaching, 2 of them, moving fast. "Stay inside," he told Morgan. "Whatever happens, don't show yourself." Jackson loaded the Winchester and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. He recognized the riders as they approached. Roy Scarface Coleman, with a long scar running from his ear to his chin, and Mick Hayes, Decker's loyal attack dog. "Well, well," Roy called out as they reined in their horses. "If it ain't Jackson Blackwood. Still playing rancher, I see." "This is private property, Roy," Jackson replied evenly. "State your business or ride on." Mick spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We're looking for a girl, runaway. Decker's property. Word is she might have come this way." "Ain't seen any girl," Jackson said. "And Decker should know better than to send his errand boys onto my land." Roy's hand drifted toward his holster. "Times have changed, old man. Decker runs Redemption Creek now. Even has the marshal in his pocket." "The law might be for sale," Jackson said, his finger moving to the Winchester's trigger guard. "But I ain't." The tension hung in the air like a thundercloud. Roy's eyes narrowed, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. "We know she's here, Blackwood. Hand her over, and maybe we don't burn this place to the ground." Jackson's finger squeezed the trigger at the precise moment between heartbeats, a skill few men mastered and fewer survived witnessing. The Winchester came up and a shot cracked through the morning air. Roy screamed as the bullet tore through his upper arm, precisely where Jackson had aimed. "Next one goes between your eyes," Jackson said calmly, working the lever action to chamber another round. The sound of the mechanism was like music to his ears. "Now get off my land." Mick helped Roy back onto his horse, the wounded man cursing through gritted teeth. "This ain't over," Mick called back as they turned to ride away. "Decker wants that girl, and he don't take no for an answer. We'll be back with more men." "I'm counting on it," Jackson replied. "And Roy, tell Decker that Jackson Blackwood still remembers Emma." As the dust settled, Morgan appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "Decker won't stop." Jackson checked the Winchester's action. "Then we better not be here when they return." He looked up at the sky. "There are 2 kinds of men in this world, Morgan. Those who hunt and those who are hunted. Today, we stopped being the hunted." Redemption Creek had changed in the years since Jackson had last visited. What was once a quiet trading post had swelled with the discovery of gold in the nearby hills and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad just 10 miles north. The town had the feverish energy of newfound prosperity and all the sin that came with it. Jackson rode in with Morgan seated behind him, her face concealed by a shawl. The main street bustled with activity, miners fresh from their claims, Apache traders with their wares, railroad workers spending their pay before returning to the line. Jackson noted how the saloons and brothels now outnumbered the churches 3-1. The marshal's office sat at the far end of the street, a stone building with iron bars on the windows. Jackson tied his horse and turned to Morgan. "Stay here. Keep your face covered." Inside, Marshal Franklin Iron Sullivan sat behind his desk, polishing a shotgun. He looked up as Jackson entered, surprise registering on his weathered face. "Blackwood? I heard you were dead." "Not yet," Jackson replied, closing the door behind him, though not for lack of trying on Decker's part. Sullivan set the shotgun aside. "What brings you back to town? Last I heard, you were playing rancher out in the hills." "I need your help, Franklin. Decker's men came to my place this morning, looking for a girl who escaped from the Whiskey Palace." The marshal's expression hardened. "That's Decker's business, not mine. Since when does a U.S. Marshal ignore slavery and torture?" Sullivan leaned back in his chair. "Times change, Jackson. The mining company needs happy workers. Happy workers need entertainment. Decker provides it. It's all just business." "It's against the law," Jackson countered. Sullivan laughed. "The law? Out here? The law is whoever has the most money and the most guns. Right now, that's Decker." He leaned forward. "You're smart. You know how this works. The girl goes back, and everybody forgets this happened." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Like you forgot about Emma? Like you forgot who gave you the information that led to her being taken?" The marshal's face paled. "That was different. I didn't know Decker would—" "Save it," Jackson cut him off. "You knew exactly what would happen. You took his money then, and you're taking it now." He leaned closer. "You were supposed to uphold the law, but instead you sold it to the highest bidder. My daughter paid the price." "Be careful, Blackwood," Sullivan warned, his hand inching toward his shotgun. "You've got no friends here anymore." "I never did," Jackson replied, turning to leave. "And neither do you when Decker's done with you." Outside, Jackson found Morgan where he'd left her. His face was grim as they mounted up. "The marshal won't help," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, but I know someone who might." Dr. Samuel Doc Henderson's office was on the outskirts of town, a modest building with a small sign advertising medical services. Jackson had known Doc since before he'd settled in Redemption Creek. The man was as skilled with a scalpel as he was with a deck of cards, and one of the few people Jackson still trusted. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Doc looked up from his desk, recognition spreading across his face. "Jackson Blackwood," he said, rising to his feet. "It's been years." The men clasped hands warmly. "Need your help, Doc," Jackson said. "This is Morgan. She escaped from Decker's place. She needs somewhere safe to stay while I sort things out." Doc examined Morgan's injuries with a professional eye. "Decker's work, I assume. The man's a butcher." He shook his head. "I'll tend to her, but you should know. Things have changed around here." "So I've heard." Doc lowered his voice. "My son, Thomas. After his mother died, he fell in with the wrong crowd. He's working for Decker now." Jackson's eyes widened. "Thomas? But he was just a kid when I left." "He's 22 now. Decker's right-hand man." The news hit Jackson like a physical blow. Thomas had been like a nephew to him once, the boy who'd followed him around, begging to learn to shoot. "The boy I taught to shoot now points his gun at men I once called friends," Jackson said quietly. "The circle of violence I started has come full circle." "I'm sorry, Jackson," Doc continued, "but if you're planning what I think you are, you should know. Thomas will be standing with Decker, not us." Night had fallen over Redemption Creek. In the back room of Doc's office, Jackson laid out his plan. "Decker's got at least 10 men at the Whiskey Palace," he explained, cleaning his Colt methodically. The revolver came apart in his hands with practiced ease. Cylinder, barrel, frame. Each piece was oiled, inspected, and reassembled with precision. Plus whatever hired guns he's brought in since this morning, Doc added, pouring 3 fingers of whiskey into a glass. And Thomas knows every move you're likely to make. Jackson loaded the Colt with .36 caliber rounds, the brass gleaming in the lamplight. Not every move. Jackson strapped the second Colt to his ankle, an old lawman's trick that had saved his life more than once. Always keep an ace in your boot, he muttered, for when your hand runs out of cards. Morgan sat nearby, her wounds bandaged. There are 6 other girls at the palace, she said quietly, all like me, trapped. Some have been there for years. Jackson and Doc exchanged glances. Decker keeps them locked in the rooms upstairs, she continued. The only time they come out is when they're working. Jackson's jaw tightened. It wasn't just about Morgan anymore. It wasn't even about settling an old score. There were innocent lives at stake. A sharp knock at the window startled them. Jackson had his gun drawn before Doc could even turn. Outside, a shadow moved quickly away. Decker's spy, Jackson said grimly, holstering his weapon. We're being watched. Doc moved to the window, pulling the curtains tight. Then we need to move fast. Another knock, this time at the door. Doc answered it cautiously, then returned with a grim expression. Bad news. Decker's brought in reinforcements. Comancheros from south of the border. At least a dozen of them, led by Javier Espinoza. Jackson cursed under his breath. The Comancheros were notorious border bandits. Killers and slavers with no loyalty except to money. We need more men, Doc said. Jackson shook his head. No time. Decker will expect us to gather a posse. He'll move the girls before we can act. He checked his Winchester one last time. We go tonight, just the 2 of us. Doc hesitated, then nodded. For Thomas's sake as much as the girls. Whatever my son has become, there's still good in him. I have to believe that. Then let's go save him, Jackson said, from Decker and from himself. The Whiskey Palace loomed at the end of the street, its windows glowing with lamplight. Music and raucous laughter spilled from its doors. 2 guards stood at the entrance, hands resting on their holsters. Jackson and Doc approached from the shadows, moving silently between buildings. Back door? Doc whispered. Jackson nodded. You create a distraction out front. I'll go in through the kitchen. He gripped Doc's shoulder firmly. If you find Thomas, he's still your son. I know, Jackson replied. I'll do what I can. Minutes later, a fire broke out in the stables across from the Whiskey Palace. As the guards rushed to help control the blaze, Jackson slipped through the back entrance. The kitchen was empty except for a Chinese cook who took one look at Jackson's gun and raised his hands, backing away silently. Jackson moved through the service corridor, the sounds of the saloon growing louder. Through a doorway, he could see the main floor, gambling tables, a long bar, and men drinking with painted women on their arms. Victor Decker sat at a private table in the corner, flanked by Thomas Henderson and a Mexican man who could only be Espinoza. Jackson took a deep breath, checked his weapons, and stepped through the doorway. The first shot took down a guard before anyone realized what was happening. The second shattered a bottle behind the bar. Decker! Jackson roared, the saloon falling silent. It's time we finish this. Chaos erupted. Patrons dove for cover as Decker's men drew their weapons. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. Jackson took cover behind an overturned table, firing methodically. 2 of Decker's men fell, then a third. From outside came more gunfire. Doc had joined the fight. A bullet grazed Jackson's arm, tearing his sleeve and drawing blood. Another embedded itself in the table inches from his head. Through the smoke and confusion, he saw Thomas dragging Decker toward a staircase. Espinoza and his Comancheros formed a protective line, firing to keep Jackson pinned down. Upstairs, Jackson shouted to Doc, who had entered through the front. The girls are upstairs, Doc nodded, firing his shotgun twice more before heading for the stairs. Jackson provided covering fire, emptying his Colt and switching to the Winchester. In the chaos, Jackson didn't see Mick Hayes until it was almost too late. The man lunged from behind, a knife flashing in his hand. Jackson swung the rifle around, using it to block the blade. They crashed to the floor, wrestling for control. Hayes was younger, stronger, but Jackson fought with the desperation of a man with nothing to lose. He slammed his forehead into Hayes's nose, feeling it break. As Hayes reeled back, Jackson grabbed the fallen knife and drove it into the man's chest. "That's for every girl you ever hurt," Jackson growled as the light faded from Hayes's eyes. Gunfire continued around him as he retrieved the Winchester and headed for the stairs. Bodies littered the saloon floor, Decker's men and Comancheros alike. Upstairs, he found Doc standing over an unconscious Thomas. "He'll live," Doc said grimly. "I had to knock him out." The boy's eyes held none of the admiration they once did, only cold resignation. "You taught me to survive in this world," Thomas had told him just before Doc struck him. "Just never thought I'd be using those lessons against you." "The girls?" "In there." Doc pointed to a locked door. "I haven't been able to get it open." A shot rang out from the end of the hallway. Jackson spun to see Victor Decker, a smoking revolver in his hand. Doc cried out, falling to his knees as blood blossomed on his shirt. "You should have stayed away, Jackson," Decker said, advancing slowly. "Some ghosts should stay buried." "Like Emma," Jackson replied, his voice cold as steel. Decker smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. "She was just business. Nothing personal." "That's where you're wrong," Jackson said. "It was always personal." Jackson raised the Winchester, but Decker fired first. The bullet struck Jackson's shoulder, spinning him around. The rifle clattered to the floor. Decker stood over him, revolver aimed at Jackson's head. "Any last words, old friend?" Jackson looked up, blood seeping between his fingers as he clutched his wound. "Just 3. This is for Emma." His hand moved in a blur, drawing the second Colt from his ankle holster. The shot echoed in the narrow hallway, and Decker stumbled backward, a look of surprise on his face as he collapsed. "I never was your friend," Jackson said, standing over Decker's body. With Decker down, Jackson freed the imprisoned girls, including Morgan. Doc's wound wasn't fatal. The bullet had passed through his side without hitting anything vital. As dawn broke over Redemption Creek, Marshal Sullivan arrived with a posse, too late as usual. He found Jackson sitting on the steps of the Whiskey Palace, his wounds bandaged. "You've caused quite a mess, Blackwood," Sullivan said, surveying the damage. Jackson looked up, his eyes hard. "These girls are leaving town, Franklin. They're going somewhere to start new lives. And you're going to make sure no one follows them? And why would I do that?" Jackson reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, a bank draft with Sullivan's name on it, signed by Decker. "Because if you don't, copies of this go to the federal marshal in Denver, along with my sworn statement about what happened to Emma and how you helped Decker find her." Sullivan's face paled. "You wouldn't. Try me." 1 week later, Jackson stood on his porch, watching as Morgan prepared to board the eastbound stage. Doc had arranged for her and the other girls to stay with his sister in Denver until they could find proper work. Thomas had gone with them, a chance to start fresh, away from Decker's shadow. "Why did you help me?" Morgan asked as she adjusted her new bonnet, a gift from Doc. "You could have been killed." Jackson leaned against the porch post, his arm still in a sling. "There are some sins that can't be forgiven, only redeemed. Today, I redeemed part of mine." Morgan kissed his cheek before climbing into the stage. "Your daughter would be proud," she said softly. Jackson nodded, a lump in his throat. As the coach pulled away, Jackson fingered the old U.S. Marshal badge in his pocket, a reminder of the man he once was and might be again. Perhaps there were still wrongs to be righted, still redemption to be found. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky blood red. Somewhere out there, the remaining Comancheros were regrouping. Javier Espinoza wasn't the type to forget a defeat, but that was a battle for another day. "How about you, friend?" Jackson said, seeming to speak directly to those listening. "When your moment of redemption comes, what choice will you make? In the quiet moments when you're alone with your past, what ghosts are you willing to face to find your peace?" The stage disappeared over the ridge, carrying Morgan toward a new beginning. For Jackson Blackwood, the road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was no longer shadowed by the ghosts of his past. "Remember," he said quietly, "in this life, it's not how you start that matters, it's how you finish."